In late 1962, inside a nondescript engineering building in Warren, Michigan, a small group of General Motors engineers were breaking a rule that could get every one of them fired. GM had a corporate policy, signed and enforced since 1957, that explicitly banned the company from participating in any form of motorsport. No factory backing, no factory engines, no factory involvement of any kind. And yet, behind locked doors, a team led by a Belgian-born engineer named Zora Arkus-Duntov was quietly building the most powerful racing engine Chevrolet had ever created. They called it Project Mystery. Nobody outside a tiny circle of trusted engineers even knew it existed. It was built in secret, tested in secret, and shipped to Daytona Beach in unmarked crates so that nobody, not GM's own board of directors, not the press, not even most of the drivers who would eventually sit behind the wheel, would know what was coming. And when it finally showed up at Daytona International Speedway in February of 1963, it was so far ahead of everything else on that track that grown men stood in the garage area in complete silence, watching a car do something they didn't think was physically possible. It shattered practice speed records by a margin nobody could explain. It sounded different. It looked different. And within days of proving it was the fastest thing NASCAR had ever seen, it vanished, banned in every way that mattered, buried by the very company that built it, before it ever got the chance to complete a single full season. This is the story of the Chevrolet Mystery Motor, the engine that was too fast to be allowed to exist. To understand why General Motors would go to such extreme lengths to hide its own engineering triumph, you have to go back to 1957. The year the Automobile Manufacturers Association, a trade group representing every major American car company, agreed to a sweeping ban on factory-supported racing. The reasoning at the time sounded almost quaint by today's standards. Safety groups and insurance companies had grown alarmed at how aggressively car companies were using speed and horsepower to sell vehicles to the public. And there was real fear that the marketing message, "Race on Sunday, buy on Monday," was encouraging reckless driving on public roads. Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors all signed on. On paper, all three companies agreed to walk away from racing entirely. In practice, only General Motors actually tried to follow the rule. Ford spent the early 1960s quietly funneling money and engineering support to teams through back channels, building what would eventually become the total performance era. Chrysler did the same thing, developing engines that would show up on racetracks looking suspiciously factory-built, despite official denials. General Motors, meanwhile, watched its own cars get beaten on Sundays by manufacturers who had simply ignored the rule they all agreed to. And that created an enormous, silent pressure inside GM's engineering divisions, especially at Chevrolet, where a handful of men were watching their competitors win and knowing, with absolute certainty, that they could build something faster if they were only allowed to try. Zora Arkus-Duntov was not a man built for quiet compliance. He had grown up in Belgium and Russia, studied engineering in Germany, escaped Europe during the collapse of the Second World War, and eventually made his way to America, where he found work at General Motors and quickly became obsessed with one project above all others: the Chevrolet Corvette. By the early 1960s, he had become the car's chief engineer and its most passionate defender, a man who genuinely believed the Corvette could be a world-class performance machine if GM would simply let his team build it that way. Duntov was known throughout the engineering divisions as someone who treated the corporate racing ban less like an ironclad law and more like an obstacle to be quietly worked around. He had already spent years finding ways to develop high-performance parts under the radar. Official ban be damned, labeling racing components as off-road or heavy-duty towing parts, so they could still be developed, tested, and sold to racers through Chevrolet dealerships without technically violating GM's own policy. It was a loophole everyone at GM understood, and nobody wanted to close, because it let engineers like Duntov keep building fast cars, while executives kept their hands officially clean. But by 1962, Duntov and a small circle of engineers wanted more than a loophole. They wanted a real weapon. What they built became known internally as the porcupine head engine, named for the unusual way its valves were angled in every direction like the quills of a porcupine rather than in the neat, uniform rows of a conventional engine. This was not a small tweak to an existing motor. It was an entirely new big block V8, displacing 427 cubic inches, engineered from the ground up to produce power numbers that were, for 1963, almost unbelievable estimates. from people who worked on the project put its output somewhere close to 500 horsepower at a time when most factory engines were struggling to reach half that number. The engineering team built the block and heads out of aluminum to save weight. Hand-assembled every unit with a level of precision that no assembly line could replicate, and tested it in near-total secrecy, often late at night, often with only a handful of people in the building aware of what was actually happening in that particular section of the plant. The men who built it knew exactly what they were risking. If GM's leadership found out a team was openly defying the company's own racing ban by developing a full factory race engine, the consequences could mean the end of careers and possibly the end of Duntov's position entirely. But they built it anyway, because they believed, correctly as it turned out, that once people saw what this engine could do, it would be too late to simply pretend it didn't exist. The plan was to bring it to Daytona for Speed Weeks in February of 1963, one of the most closely watched events on the entire NASCAR calendar, where every manufacturer showed up hoping to prove their cars were the fastest in the country heading into the new season. Getting the engines there without anyone noticing required its own kind of quiet operation. The mystery motors were shipped to Daytona hidden inside cars that looked, from the outside, like standard 1963 Chevrolets. No factory markings, no official Chevrolet racing team logos. On paper, these were privately entered cars, prepared by independent mechanics and driven by independent drivers, with absolutely no connection to General Motors whatsoever. It was a fiction everyone at the track would see through within days, but for the moment it gave GM just enough deniability to send its secret weapon into battle without technically breaking its own rule. Only a handful of trusted mechanics, most notably the legendary Smokey Yunick, one of the most respected and most notoriously rule-bending crew chiefs in NASCAR history, were brought in on exactly what these engines were and what they could do, and the drivers chosen to sit behind the wheel of these unmarked, secretly powered machines were men who had already built reputations as some of the most fearless racers in the sport, including a young, hard-charging driver named Junior Johnson, a man who, as you may already know if you've watched some of our other videos, had spent his entire life finding the exact edges of what the rules allowed and driving straight through them. When practice sessions began at Daytona that February, something happened that nobody in the garage area could immediately explain. Cars that looked on paper like ordinary 1963 Chevrolets were turning laps at speeds that simply did not match anything else on the track. Stopwatches were checked and rechecked. Mechanics from rival teams walked over to get a closer look, assuming there had to be some kind of mistake, some kind of engineering trick with the body or the suspension that could account for the gap. What they found instead, once they got close enough to hear the engine actually running, was a sound unlike anything else at Daytona that week, a deep, aggressive growl that didn't match the exhaust note of any known production Chevrolet engine. Word spread through the garage area almost instantly. Something was different about these cars, and it wasn't the paint job. By the time official qualifying began, the mystery motor Chevrolets were setting speeds that put them at or near the very front of the field. Embarrassing factory-backed Fords and Chryslers that were supposedly the fastest cars money could build. For a company that had publicly sworn off racing entirely, Chevrolet had just quietly built the fastest engine at the most important race weekend of the year. But here's where the story takes a turn that even the men who built the engine hadn't fully planned for. The instant these cars started outrunning everything else on the track, they stopped being a quiet, deniable side project and became the single biggest story of Daytona Speed Weeks. Reporters wanted to know who built these engines. Rival teams wanted to know how a privately entered Chevrolet was suddenly faster than anything Ford or Chrysler's actual factory programs had produced. And General Motors executives back in Detroit, the same executives who had spent years insisting, publicly and repeatedly, that GM had no involvement in racing whatsoever, were now watching their own alleged non-racing engine become the most talked about story in American motorsport. The secrecy that had protected the project during development became almost overnight the exact thing that was going to destroy it. You cannot build the fastest engine at the biggest race of the year and expect nobody to ask where it came from. And once people started asking, the answers were not going to be comfortable ones for a company that had built its entire public position around staying out of racing entirely. What happened next moved with a speed that stunned even the engineers who built the mystery motor. Word reached GM's senior leadership almost immediately that a Chevrolet engineering team had violated the company's own racing ban, not with a minor bent rule here or there, but with an entire secretly developed race engine that was now generating national headlines. The response was swift, and for the men who had poured months of quiet, off-the-books work into the project, devastating. GM's corporate leadership ordered an immediate and total shutdown. Every mystery motor still in development was to be destroyed or locked away. Any further racing use of the engine was strictly forbidden. Engineers involved in the project were quietly reprimanded, and in the years that followed, several of them would describe an atmosphere of genuine fear inside the engineering divisions, a sense that they had come dangerously close to ending their careers over an engine that technically wasn't even supposed to exist. The mystery motor had proven beyond any doubt that it was the fastest engine at Daytona that week, and within days of that proof, it was gone, banned not by NASCAR, not by a rulebook, but by the very company that built it, terrified of the attention its own success had generated. If you're starting to think this is simply a story about a fast engine and a strict corporate policy, stay with me, because the human side of this story is where things get genuinely heartbreaking, and it centers on a man named Smokey Yunick. Yunick was already by 1963 one of the most respected and most feared crew chiefs in the entire sport, a man with a reputation for finding advantages other mechanics couldn't even imagine, let alone execute. He had spent months of his life working on the mystery motor program, understanding better than almost anyone else in the garage exactly how special this engine truly was. Yunick would later describe watching the program get shut down as one of the most frustrating moments of his entire career. Not because he lost a competitive advantage, though he certainly did, but because he had seen, with his own eyes, an engine that could have fundamentally changed the sport. An engine built by some of the most talented engineers in the country, killed not by a competitor, not by a failure on the track, but by fear inside a boardroom, hundreds of miles away from Daytona. Yunick was a man who believed deeply in pushing boundaries, and here was proof that even the very best engineering in the world meant nothing if the people who built it were too afraid to let it exist in the open. He would go on to have a long, storied career full of legendary stories about bending and breaking NASCAR's rulebook, but those who worked closely with him say he never fully let go of what happened at Daytona in 1963. The sense that he had witnessed something genuinely extraordinary get erased almost overnight. And this is where the story connects back to a driver you may already know, Junior Johnson, the same man who years later would find a way to legally exploit exhaust routing rules and win a race before NASCAR could even write a rule against it, was one of the drivers who got to experience the mystery motor firsthand at Daytona in 1963. Johnson had already built a reputation as a man who understood, better than almost anyone in the garage, the difference between what the rulebook said and what the rulebook actually meant, sitting behind the wheel of a car with an engine that outclassed everything else on the track. Johnson reportedly described the power as unlike anything he had felt in a stock car before, a level of raw acceleration that made the rest of the field feel like they were standing still. For a driver who spent his entire career hunting for any edge he could legally find, the mystery motor represented something close to the platonic ideal, an advantage so overwhelming that it didn't need a clever trick or a technicality to win. It simply had more power than anything else on the track, and then just as quickly as he'd gotten his hands on it, it was taken away, locked back inside GM's engineering division, never to reappear in competition again. Johnson would spend the rest of his career chasing that same feeling through countless other innovations, but those who knew him say he never forgot what it felt like to drive the fastest car at Daytona for one single, unrepeatable week. If the story ended there, it would already be one of the more fascinating footnotes in automotive history, but there's a deeper layer that makes the whole episode even more remarkable, and it has to do with just how advanced this engine actually was for its time. The porcupine valve design that made the mystery motor so powerful wasn't just a clever one-off trick to win a single race weekend. The angled valve layout Duntov's team pioneered in near-total secrecy in 1962 would go on to become the foundational design principle behind an entire family of engines that Chevrolet would later release to the public, officially, openly, and with full company backing once the corporate racing ban finally loosened its grip in the years that followed. Those later engines would become some of the most celebrated and most powerful big block motors Chevrolet ever built, finding their way into legendary muscle cars that are still worshipped by collectors today. In other words, the engine that GM tried to erase from history in February of 1963 didn't actually disappear. Its DNA survived, hidden in plain sight, quietly reshaping how Chevrolet built high-performance engines for more than a decade afterward. The men who built the mystery motor lost the battle to keep it racing that week at Daytona. But in a strange, delayed sense, they eventually won the war, because the ideas they were forbidden from putting on a racetrack in 1963 ended up under the hoods of some of the most iconic muscle cars in American history. There is something almost poetic about how this story unfolded, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. General Motors spent years publicly insisting it had no involvement in racing whatsoever, all while quietly funding and developing one of the most advanced race engines the sport had ever seen, only to destroy that same engine the moment it became too successful to hide. It is a story about ambition running headlong into fear, about engineers who believed so strongly in what they were building that they were willing to risk their careers to prove it could work, and about a corporate culture so terrified of public scrutiny that it would rather bury its own greatest achievement than risk the embarrassment of getting caught. And yet, if you drive past a fully restored 1963 Chevrolet today, sitting quietly in a museum or a private collection somewhere, very few people looking at it would ever guess that some of the fastest, most dangerous engineering in Chevrolet's entire history briefly lived under a hood just like that one for one unforgettable week at Daytona before it was locked away and denied by the very people who built it. What makes this story stand apart from so many other tales of banned engines and outlawed innovations in racing history is the direction the ban actually came from. This wasn't NASCAR stepping in to protect competitive balance. This wasn't a rival manufacturer lobbying officials to shut down an unfair advantage. This was a company banning its own engine, silencing its own engineers, and erasing evidence of its own success, purely out of fear of what the public and its own leadership might think. In almost every other story of a banned car or a banned engine in motorsport history, the ban comes from outside. An outside authority stepping in because a competitor found something too powerful to allow. The mystery motor is one of the rare cases where the ban came from within, self-inflicted, driven entirely by fear rather than competition. And that single detail is what makes the story worth telling more than 60 years later, because it reveals something uncomfortable and deeply human about how even the most brilliant engineering achievements can be destroyed, not by a rival, not by a rulebook, but by the very people who should have been proudest of what they built. Zora Arkus-Duntov never stopped believing in what his team had accomplished that week at Daytona. Even after the program was shut down and the engines were locked away, he continued fighting quietly and persistently for the rest of his career at General Motors to bring high-performance engineering back into Chevrolet's lineup, eventually earning the informal but widely used title of the father of the Corvette, a car that would go on to become one of the most celebrated performance vehicles in American history. Many of the engineers who worked alongside him on the Mystery Motor project went on to have long, successful careers inside General Motors, carrying with them the lessons of what happened in 1963, understanding better than almost anyone else in the industry just how thin the line could be between corporate triumph and corporate embarrassment. Smokey Yunick continued building a legendary career as one of the most fearless and most rule-bending crew chiefs the sport has ever seen, and he would tell the story of the mystery motor for decades afterward, always with a mixture of pride and lingering frustration, proud of what the engine had proven was possible, frustrated that the world barely got to see it before it was gone, and Junior Johnson, the man who drove one of these secretly built engines to the front of the field at Daytona, went on to build one of the most storied careers in NASCAR history, eventually becoming a car owner who would find his own way to bend the rules of the sport, using the same instincts that had made him so effective behind the wheel of the mystery motor years earlier. Today, the Chevrolet mystery motor is remembered by automotive historians as one of the most significant engines never allowed to fully prove itself, a piece of engineering so far ahead of its time that the company that built it panicked at the sight of its own success. It represents a strange and uniquely American kind of contradiction, a corporation obsessed with performance and speed, yet terrified of the attention that performance and speed could bring. It is a story about brilliant, stubborn engineers who understood deep down that sometimes the only way to prove an idea is possible is to build it first and ask permission later, even when asking permission later means risking everything you've worked for. And it is a story about how history sometimes buries its most remarkable achievements, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too completely, too visibly, too fast for the people in charge to feel comfortable letting the world see what had really been built behind those locked doors in Warren, Michigan. The engine that once dominated a single unforgettable week at Daytona in February of 1963 never got the chance to race again after General Motors shut the program down, and for decades afterward. It existed mostly as a rumor among serious automotive historians and old-timers who had actually been there to see it with their own eyes. Very few surviving examples remain today, scattered among private collectors and museum archives, treated less like ordinary engines and more like relics of a moment that General Motors itself tried desperately to make disappear. And that more than the horsepower numbers, more than the porcupine valve design, more than the speed records it briefly held at Daytona, is what makes the Chevrolet mystery motor one of the most fascinating stories in the entire history of American racing, an engine so good, so far ahead of everything else on the track, that the company that built it decided the safest thing to do was pretend it had never existed at all.